The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Hi, my name is Michael Blackburn. I'm 25 years old, and I don't trust vegans. It's not because of the reasons you might think. I don't trust vegans not because of their obnoxious, overbearing, pick-me personalities, although those that specifically turn being vegan into their only attribute and try to force everyone around them into veganism are especially annoying. No, I don't trust vegans because my ex was a vegan, and Neil, well, he was an asshole. He didn't start out that way, though. I suppose nobody really does. Neil was more like my knight in shining armor in the beginning. He rescued me, literally and figuratively. Neil and I met when I was going through a tough time. I'd just broken up with my ex, Stephen. Things weren't the best at work. I worked for a really competitive marketing agency, and with all that going on, my rent doubled, and the lease on my apartment was about to end. I needed to find somewhere more affordable to live, which in Denver was nigh impossible. I convinced myself a hike was just the thing I needed to clear my head. The Colorado Trail is where I found myself the day I met Neil. I'd gone on a few hikes before, all shorter trails than the Colorado Trail, of course, but never so far and by myself. Since I went alone and was a relative beginner, hiking the entire trail was a no-go. The entirety of the Colorado Trail takes 4 to 6 weeks to hike. Instead, that hike was going to be from the Waterton Canyon Trailhead to the South Platte River Trailhead, the first segment of the trail, over the course of a weekend. Day 1. I'd hike the 7 or so hours to the end of the segment and set up camp for the night. Day 2 would be spent hiking back down to the start of the trail and to my car. Overall, I'd be hiking about 32 miles there and back, 16 miles each day. My end goal was to be too exhausted to even think about the breakup and the numerous other problems in my life. The first day went fine, if not a little long. The skies had been clear. The breeze was nice, and the terrain wasn't too bad. It got a little tough at times, be it the steep and somewhat slick pathway or the quickly thinning air as I gained altitude. I had gone in the spring too, so that meant I was bug and mosquito food. But at the end of the day, the view was amazing and made all the hardships worth it. I had set off on the trail early in the morning, beginning the hike at about 8 a.m., factor in the estimated time for the first section and a couple half-hour breaks. I ended up reaching my campsite around 4 p.m. That gave me plenty of time to set up my tent and enjoy a nice dinner of roasted hot dogs and a can of baked beans before the sun set. As I wound down and enjoyed my little feast that evening, I noticed a couple of storm clouds rolling in, past the pastel horizon. I thought nothing of it at the time. As the storm didn't look too menacing, I knew my tent could take whatever was thrown at it. In fact, I welcomed a little bit of rain. It had gotten very warm during the hike that day. A light storm was just the thing to cool the air down a bit. As soon as I had gone to bed, I heard little patters of raindrops falling onto the outside of my tent. I had been exhausted, but content and sleep easily overtook me. The sound of rain and light rumbles of thunder in the distance had only aided me to my dreams. At some point that night, the storm passed. What I hadn't realized was the fog that would settle over the mountain range. Imagine my surprise the next morning when I crawled out of my tent and could barely see 5 feet in front of me. The fog itself was so thick, sticky, and utterly overbearing. I tried to wait out the fog for an hour, but it seemed to be stagnant and unwavering, having wasted enough time. I packed up camp and tried my best to hike down the trail. I'd needed to get back before sundown in order to make it to work in time the next morning. Somewhere along the way, I had taken a wrong turn and gotten myself lost. Only when the fog dissipated for just a moment did I come to realize my unfamiliar surroundings and the grave error I'd made. Also, in that brief moment, did this ominous feeling overcome me, like I was being watched, stalked. Right before the fog thickened again, I could have sworn I'd seen a dark silhouette move off somewhere in the distant tree line. A twig had broken somewhere close by and had pushed me over the edge. Like a dumbass, I just picked a direction and ran, forgetting about the fog entirely. The fog most definitely didn't forget about me, or the slick rocks that I slipped on shortly after making my getaway. In a panicked effort to overcorrect my falling momentum and lessen the impact, I shifted weirdly, achieving the entire opposite outcome I was hoping for. My left foot twisted at an awkward angle as it connected to the ground. I held my scream in as a sharp, stinging pain radiated from my ankle. After a moment of rest, I picked myself up, trying to see if I could hold weight on that foot. The pain resulting from the attempt confirmed that I should try to avoid doing that at all costs. I had sprained it, at worst broken it. After finding a decent walking stick, I managed to limp my way around, in search of rescue or the trail. I'd been lost for about 6 hours before he found me. It was late afternoon at that point, nearly evening. I'd been resting on a random boulder in a clearing, munching on a protein bar. Thoughts of trying to survive after the sun went down occupied my mind. I'd been so lost in thought, I hadn't noticed Neil slowly approaching me. A soft "hey" left his mouth as he emerged from the tree line. Startled, I yelped, then grabbed my walking stick and held it out defensively as a weapon. "Relax, I'm not going to hurt you," the strange man had clarified. "That's reassuring," I huffed. "How do I know I can trust you? We're in the middle of nowhere." The beautiful stranger slowly walked towards me. When at an appropriate length away, he stuck his hand out for me to shake. "I'm Neil Yen." Hesitantly, I shook his hand back, eyeing the man up and down suspiciously. He was tall and lanky. He had green eyes, short black hair, and was not dressed to be hiking. He wore slides, a pair of sweatpants and a blue and white striped V-neck. Neil looked like he was trying to be the Asian version of Harry Styles. "We're not in the middle of nowhere, by the way," Neil commented. I stared at the mountainside behind him, unamused. He conceded. "Okay, fine, we're in the middle of nowhere, but my cabin isn't too far away from here. One of my trail cams caught you walking past it. I saw you were injured and came looking for you." "That's not creepy at all," I muttered under my breath. Neil let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine, I'll leave you and that stick of yours to spend the night right in the middle of cougar territory." He then pivoted on the balls of his feet, back towards the tree line. "No," I pleaded suddenly, almost falling off the boulder. Neil turned around and looked at me quizzically. I cleared my throat and composed myself. "How far away is this cabin of yours?" Neil smiled before walking over and helping me to my feet. "See you Monday. The ATV is this way." After finally making it to Neil's ATV, I was surprised he'd made it that far wearing those clothes. "So, do you have a name?" Neil asked after I took my seat on the passenger side. He'd tried to take my walking stick away from me and put it in the back, but I clung onto it, just in case I needed it for protection. "Mikkel." Neil started the ATV and began driving off, presumably to his cabin. "Well, Michel, it's nice to meet you." Inexplicably, I somehow felt safe in Neil's presence. Yes, at first, there was the initial hesitation and paranoia that he was a serial killer. But after that short walk, seeing how caring and gentle he'd been with me, my opinion of him was starting to change. That's how I rationalized why I was able to drift off to sleep during the ride anyway. I awoke somewhere warm and cozy. I had been on a couch. A fire in the fireplace beside me filled the air with sizzles and cracks. My memories came back to me after a second, and I deduced this must have been Neil's living room. Lifting the Indian blanket that was draped over me revealed my injured foot had been elevated on a pillow and expertly bandaged. "What the—" "I know my way around the human body," Neil responded from behind me. I stood and turned around, scrunching my eyebrows, finding that an odd choice of words. He was holding 2 steaming mugs in his hands. Are you a doctor or something? Neil handed me a mug. It was full of some sort of tea. I placed it down on the coffee table. I don't like tea. No.
An artist,
He replied. I then took a closer look around his living room. There was barely any unoccupied space on his walls. Charcoal and watercolor paintings and portraits of strange creatures and weird-looking dragons were everywhere. You painted all these? I asked, impressed. Neil nodded proudly. A silent, awkward tension formed between us. Neil nervously scratched behind his ear. Sorry, I'm not really good with people. Oh crap, I shouted, looking out the windows, noticing it was dark outside. What's wrong? What is it? Neil asked, concerned. What time is it? I've got to get down the mountain. I'll lose my job if I don't show up in the morning. Calm down, Michelle, Neil said, gently sitting me back down on the couch. You're in no condition to be going anywhere right now. Do you at least have phone service up here? I need to make some calls and let my work know what's going on. No, I don't, Neil answered. Well, I also need a doctor, and you just told me you weren't one. So, I also told you I know a thing or two about the human body. Why don't you let me take care of your job tomorrow? I also told you I know a thing or two about the human body. Why don't you let me take care of your job tomorrow? I let out a disbelieving laugh. Listen, I'm grateful for the help. Really, I truly am. I just don't know you, and I'm certainly not going to let you talk to my job. I'll tell you what. I'll drive us down to where we can get some cell service, and I'll let you make your calls. Then I'll get some medical supplies for your foot and we'll come back. If you think I'm staying cooped up here for an unspecified amount of time, you're crazy. I tried to stand up and get away from this crazy man, but I slipped and almost ended up falling on my ass. Neil reacted in time and caught me. We stared into each other's eyes for a minute before he gently sat me back on the couch. I cleared my throat, waiting for the butterflies in my stomach to disappear. Not an unspecified amount of time, just a few days, only until you can walk on your feet better. Then I'll take you home. Just think about it for the night. Okay? He asked, leaving the room. He didn't hear it, but I'd said softly, okay. A minute later, Neil emerged from his kitchen holding 2 large wooden bowls. In them were giant portions of a delicious-looking salad. Want some food? What are you, a vegetarian? I asked, sarcastically, taking the giant bowl from him. He sat down on the other side of the couch and dug in. There were large pieces of lettuce, kale, and a couple other greens and vegetables I couldn't quite place. Chopped nuts and a sweet oriental sauce were drizzled on top. The tea Neil had served me earlier most definitely would have paired well with the salad. I'm a vegan, he replied. The next day, we drove down the mountain in Neil's blue Jeep. I only managed to call my manager and greet him before Neil ripped the phone out of my hands. He then left me in the Jeep while he talked to my boss. He came back with a giant smile plastered on his face. Neil had somehow convinced my boss to put me on paid medical leave until my ankle was fully healed. And if I got really fidgety during the healing process, I'd be able to work remotely. I don't know what Neil said or what he did, but he lessened the heavy load on my shoulders after doing that. He made it so I could focus on healing instead of working. Neil then drove into town and found a pharmacy. He gave me a pleading look right before he went in. That look said he'd understand if I wasn't there when he got back, but he'd be sad if I left. I don't know what compelled me to stay, but I did. Neil was overjoyed to still find me sitting in the passenger seat of his car. We drove back up the mountain and I showered, with Neil fashioning me a nice splint and rewrapping my foot when I was done. I fell asleep on the couch sometime after. When I woke up later that afternoon, Neil was nowhere in sight. His absence gave me an opportunity to properly explore my surroundings. The first thing I investigated was the kitchen. I stole a granola bar from Neil's pantry as I looked around. He wasn't kidding about being a vegan. The fridge was full of all kinds of fruits and vegetables. His cabinets contained all different types of nuts and grains. No meat or animal products in sight. The kitchen itself was pretty small, but chic. There was a small gas stove, a microwave, sink, and beautifully chiseled granite countertops. The flooring, like it was throughout the entire cabin, was a dark stained hardwood. I left the kitchen and found the adjacent dining room. A small, four-person table occupied the space. Dark wooden chairs accompanied the piece of furniture. More of Neil's artwork hung on the walls. Most of the pieces depicted a weird-looking dragon creature. It had a flat face, shaped like a lion's. Two huge horns sat on its head, and a set of razor-sharp teeth jutted out of its mouth. By the looks of it, it was huge. It could be described as a dragon, mixed with an ox-like appearance. I made my way back to the master bed and bathroom, where I'd showered earlier. Neil kept his room. Hell, his house. Very tidy. His king-sized bed was made and his blackout curtains drawn, cloaking the room in darkness. The only other pieces of furniture were a set of nightstands and a dresser. A large mirror was perched on top of Neil's dresser. Peculiarly, there had been a cloth hung over its reflective surface. There were no pictures of friends and family or drawings in there. The walls were completely barren, leaving me nothing that told me about the kind of person Neil was. I strolled out of the bedroom and back into the living room. The cabin was one floor and I'd searched it thoroughly, not finding Neil. I figured he was outside somewhere and left through the front door. His porch was small and rickety. A rocking chair and small table beside it were the only things indicating that someone occupied the place. Weeds and overgrown bushes littered the sides of the house. The driveway was dirt. Go figure. Neil lived in the mountains. I followed a small, almost hidden, stone path along the side of the house to the backyard. Phew, this place is a dump, I commented after finding Neil on his back patio at the end of my little stroll around the cabin. Neil had set up an easel and large canvas. He was in the middle of painting another sort of creature using charcoal. The grass in the backyard was overgrown, and weeds pushed through the terracotta tiling, cracking them. Neil's property had so much potential to be exquisitely beautiful. It had been a shame that it was in such a state of disrepair. "It's my dump," Neil said as he continued making strokes on his canvas, brushing the insult off completely. "What are you doing walking around? You should be resting." I shrugged my shoulders, felt like exploring. A quiet moment passed as Neil continued his artwork. "What is that anyway?" I asked as he sketched another weird dragon-looking thing. "There's like a million others hanging up in the cabin." "It's a neon," he explained. "A what now?" I asked, perplexed. It sounded like he'd just spoken gibberish. "Enyen," Neil sounded out slowly and phonetically for me. "It's a creature from Chinese mythology." "Well, you learn something new every day," was all I could think to say. "Why does it seem so familiar?" "The neon is associated with Chinese New Year," Neil answered. "You've probably seen the giant puppet version that people parade around in on TV somewhere. That, and I've got a bunch of paintings of it hanging up inside." I nodded my head. "Ah, makes sense." Another moment passed. "Interesting," I said, thinking back on possible shows and movies I'd seen the creature in. Neil then put the piece of charcoal down, wiping the black dust off the tips of his fingers on his pants. "See you Monday. Let's get you back inside before you catch a fever." Neil tried to grab my arm to take the brunt of my weight, but I stubbornly shrugged him off. He opted to walk by my side as I pathetically limped around instead. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't just depend on Neil to do everything for me. "Hey Neil, would you paint me like one of your French girls?" I asked, sitting back down on the couch. He Saturday next to me, closer than the previous night. "Sure. One day maybe," Neil said with a boisterous laugh, unknowingly beginning to lightly slap my outer thigh. When his laughing fit was over with, his large but gentle hand lingered on that part of my body. Neil had then realized his actions and quickly stood up, awkwardly clearing his throat. A familiar heat burned in my cheeks. I'd been blushing. Suddenly he spoke. "It's getting late. I should go make something for dinner. Can you make that salad again? It was really good," I requested, propping my foot up, making myself comfortable. Neil's smile returned as he politely nodded. He then made his way to the kitchen where I heard him start preparing our meal. As I Saturday there, I found I was starting to like Neil's smile. Over the course of those next couple days, Neil tended to me as my injury healed. We slowly began to trust one another more and began opening up. I learned that his parents had died when he was a relatively young age. He'd gotten into some trouble in his youth and ended up living as a hermit in the mountains because he wasn't good with people. Neil learned that I was originally from Utah, had been disowned by my highly religious family for being attracted to men, and that I was not the experienced hiker I thought I was. He didn't seem to mind my sexuality, which was a plus, and found my hiking prowess joke to be quite funny. Eventually, after a day of complaining that I had none of my things or my comfy clothes to wear, Neil brought me back down the mountain and to my apartment. I'd done a really dumb, impulsive thing. After arriving at my apartment, I thought we'd bonded and formed a connection up in his cabin. So, before he left, I kissed him. Neil was stunned at first. His silence scared me. I felt like shit and apologized a million times, not knowing his sexuality or asking him for consent. I stood there in the doorway of my apartment waiting to be slapped or screamed at. Instead, Neil just kissed me back. Before I knew it, we were both in my bedroom with our clothes off. Needless to say, we might have set my healing progress back a bit that day. That's the fast-track version of how we became a couple anyway. I know. So far, I've portrayed Neil as this kind, caring stranger, and our 2-year relationship as something out of a romance novel. But that's not the whole story. Neil, well, he'd always been sort of peculiar. I'd known that from the beginning. Over the course of our relationship, these small things would happen, seemingly randomly. But if you cluster them together, looking back over a period of years, a sort of pattern emerges. Neil hated like every holiday for one thing. The 4th of July, New Year's, Chinese New Year. Neil especially hated that day for some reason. Basically any day that was celebrated with fireworks, Neil couldn't stand. Don't even get me started on Halloween. Thanksgiving, because he was a vegan. Duh. That one was the only understandable gripe. Neil barely tolerated Christmas. Barely. It's Christmas, for Christ's sake. I'd also come to learn that Neil could be kind of pushy too. We almost broke up because of our dietary differences. I was adamant we could both have our diets, and I was even willing to eat less animal products for his sake. Neil, on the other hand, insisted I strictly eat vegan, even when he wasn't around. Then during one fight, he said it was a deal-breaker thing. So to appease him, I became a vegan. He'd always say he could tell when I ate meat and that he could smell it on my breath. Anyway, other than all that, there's one incident I constantly look back on when thinking of Neil. It happened when I was fixing the cabin up after my ankle had fully healed. As a thank you to Neil for his kindness, I decided I'd do some much-needed work around the cabin and bring some life into the property. I had just finished the outside of the house. I spruced the front yard up by planting white lilies, red roses, and purple peonies. I revamped the back patio by pulling the weeds, fixing the tiles, and stringing up canopy lights. I also found a cheap, but nice-looking, patio set that I put out there. The best and important thing about the backyard was that there was still room for Neil to paint out there. The outside was practically perfect, but my next task was to start working on the inside. Before I could start redecorating, though, the walls needed a fresh coat of paint, and they needed just a little pop, so I was going to paint a couple of the walls a majestic deep red. I'd been in the living room, just having painted a few strokes on the wall, when Neil walked in the front door. He hadn't been supposed to be back for a couple more hours. I became displeased since I was trying to surprise him with the paint job. I hadn't told him I was doing it. What are you doing?" Neil asked as he noticed the red streaks on his wall. "I'm painting, darling. What does it look like?" Another stroke of my brush resulted in another red streak. Neil's eyes went wide and he started to freak a little. "Stop that." I stopped painting as requested. "What? Why? It's a lovely color." "I don't appreciate the color red." "Michelle," Neil grumbled under his breath, balling his fists up. "Is that like a Chinese thing, not liking red?" I asked. "Wow," Neil gasped. "That's like really racist." "Mikkel, and you're like really Chinese." "Neil," I retorted. Neil scoffed and crossed his arms into his chest before nodding his head disapprovingly. "You're not really redeeming yourself here." "Oh, really?" I said, mischievously raising an eyebrow. I set my paintbrush down and stalked behind him, beginning to seductively rub his shoulders. I whispered into his ear, "How can I redeem myself?" Then, "Don't paint my walls red," Neil responded bluntly, my sexual advances not improving his mood like I'd planned. I groaned in frustration as I put the lid back on my red paint. I looked at the rusty eggshell-colored wall disapprovingly. "You're lucky I have some paint I can spare," was the last thing Neil said on that matter. It took me a couple more days, but my home makeover was eventually completed. The space seemed lighter when I was done with it. Happier. Neil really liked it too. He didn't say it in words, but with his actions, I could just tell he liked having the touch of another man in his home. He liked it so much, we threw a little party after the makeover was done, just the two of us. There, Neil asked me to move in with him. He'd said, seeing as I'd put so much effort into fixing the place up, it'd be a shame if I didn't get to live in it. The prospect of taking the next step forward in our relationship was exhilarating. It was so exciting, in fact, that I brushed the red paint incident off like it was just another one of Neil's cute quirks. The day we met was also the day we broke up, the 2-year anniversary of when Neil found me lost on the mountainside. It was also the day I was planning to propose to him. I was a wreck that day, a bundle of nerves and excitement. The engagement had been thoroughly thought out and planned, just needed to be executed, without a hitch, I might add. Of course, God laughs when you have a plan. Neil had an art installation which meant he'd be gone for most of the day. Fine with me since I had a lot to set up. My plan was to romance the shit out of Neil so he'd say yes. Most of the day was spent setting up this grand and romantic spot in the backyard. I had ordered a giant heart made out of roses, white because at that point, Neil's disdain for red had been embedded in my brain. There was the path of flower petals from the back door to the heart, a bajillion tiny candles, and these adorable little paper lanterns that fastened over the string lights above the patio. The whole 9 yards. The engagement ring had been ready for weeks at that point, living in my pocket since picking it out at the jeweler's. All that was left was to pick up dinner. Now, Neil and I's favorite food joint was this little hole-in-the-wall Chinese restaurant. The food was really greasy, salty, and there were vegetarian and vegan alternatives. We always got the same thing, the impossible steak lo mein. That night I picked up our usual to-go order, but made a slight deviation. The truth is, I hadn't gone completely vegan. Every now and then, when Neil wasn't around, I'd sneak some steak or chicken here or there. Since it was a special occasion, I decided to order myself the regular steak lo mein with extra steak. I also asked for extra impossible meat for Neil so he wouldn't get suspicious. I thanked the workers after acquiring and paying for the food, who wished me luck after I told them my plan, and then I set back off to the cabin in my Ford Explorer. I didn't get home until about 7, 30 minutes before Neil was set to arrive. Everything was going well until Neil got home. The love spot was ready. The dining room table was set. The only thing left to do was put out our food. I was in the middle of plating our food when Neil walked through the door. My heart started racing and my palms got sweaty. My brain kind of melted and turned to mush as I became a complete nervous wreck. I took off to the living room to greet my soon-to-be fiancé. Neil immediately clocked that something was off the second he saw me, probably because I was a pale, vibrating mess. "What's going on?" Neil had asked suspiciously. He looked me up and down, noting the navy blue suit I wore. "It's the 2-year anniversary of when we first met." Silly. I played it off somewhat smoothly. We never really did anything too fancy for our anniversary the year before, and I was not known to be seen in formal wear. I thought I'd do something special. "Right," Neil said, squinting at me. It was obvious he didn't know what to make of the situation. He most definitely hadn't suspected that I was going to propose to him. "Come, sit at the table." Neil followed me to our dining room table and promptly took his seat after I'd pulled his seat out for him. After he was seated, I sprinted to the kitchen and finished shoveling food onto our plates. Neil smiled when he'd seen I'd gotten our favorite. This looks like a lovely meal. Thank you. Dig in, I said, initiating the meal. Neil obliged by taking a big first bite. His eyes rolled to the back of his head as his tongue tasted the delicious faux meat. Neil let out an almost sensual moan. Oh, this is so good. I smiled with delight, about to take my own bite, when I realized something was missing. I'd forget to pour our wine. I raced to the kitchen to grab our best bottle of white. I grabbed 2 wine glasses out of the cabinet, then returned to the table. I set the glasses down and poured us each a decent amount. I took my seat, then took a sip of wine. Neil had another large mouthful of food in his mouth. So, how did the installment go? I asked, taking my first bite. It tasted good. Normal. I slipped my hand in the pocket with the ring box. I fidgeted with it nervously. However, Neil didn't answer me. He was too busy shoveling mouthfuls of lo mein into his face. Relax. It's all yours, Neil. You better slow down, or you won't be able to breathe. I joked. Why don't you take a sip of your wine? I ate my second bite. Something was off. I chewed slowly, fully analyzing the flavors on my tongue. My eyes widened as I realized that the meat tasted how it usually did when we got the vegan alternative. But I should have been eating the real steak version. I must have accidentally switched the 2 meals in my haste. Neil was eating real steak. I looked across the table after I realized. I wanted to tell him my mistake, but something was off about Neil. I could tell something in him had changed. He started acting weird. He was slurping his food down like he hadn't eaten in ages. He had forgone utensils altogether, shoveling meat and noodles into his mouth with his bare hands. He was making a mess. All the while he was making these weird noises. He was moaning and groaning with ecstasy, sounding relieved. About what? I had no clue. Neil? He finished his plate at that point, throwing it behind him when finished. The plate shattered to bits as it crashed on the floor behind him. Neil then looked across the table to see my full plate. More. He growled like an animal as he grabbed my food. He brought his face down to the plate and began eating as if he were a pig eating out of a trough. I stared in shock and awe as Neil continued to behave erratically. I'd never seen him act like that before. It was pretty unsettling. When he was done my portion of food, Neil looked around as if he was in search of thirds. He didn't find any more steak lo mein, but he did find me. As Neil looked into my eyes, I could see this primal hunger in them. He took a menacing step closer to me. Neil, cut it out. You're scaring me! Meat, he mumbled under his breath, leaping towards me. I shrieked and moved out of the way. Neil quickly regained his balance and stared at me. His eyes, they were black and beady. Sensing he was going to try to attack me again, I darted for safety in the kitchen. Neil chased after me. In an attempt to buy myself some time, I threw the remaining Chinese food behind me. Neil seemed to take the bait. He stopped chasing me and instead got on his hands and knees, licking the leftover food off the kitchen floor. A wave of nausea passed over me as I stood there in a trance, horrified as I watched the man I loved acting crazy. I didn't understand what had happened to my kind. Sweet Neil. All that was left of him was this creature, this monster. I was beginning to understand why Neil was a hardcore vegan. Something then started happening to Neil's body. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but that quickly changed. Neil's nails grew longer, sharper, darker. He started gaining mass as these large protrusions pushed up from underneath his shirt. Shiny patches of scales started growing on Neil's skin. I booked it out of the kitchen, through the living room, and out the front door. I was about to get in my car when Neil suddenly pounced on me from behind with supernatural speed and strength. Using his sharpened nail, he cut the back of my knee, causing me to fall to the ground. Neil then dragged me back into the cabin, all with a sadistic smile on his face as he licked his lips in anticipation. His face had become semi-human. The other half looked distorted, like something out of his paintings. I screamed and yelled for help, a fruitless effort since we lived in the middle of a mountain. I kicked, wiggled, and grabbed onto anything I could. Please, I cried. Why are you doing this to me? I thought you loved me. I never loved you, Neil hissed. a seething hatred burning in his eyes. I stopped squirming as my heart fell into my stomach. What? More of the Neil I knew kept slipping away by the second. Don't you get it? Neil leaned down, dragging a sharp claw against the skin on my cheek, drawing thick rivulets of blood. He licked my blood off of his nail, savoring the metallic taste. We were never partners. You were just my pet. Neil, stop. This isn't you, I had said, trying to free myself from his increasingly tight grasp. If he kept going, he'd break a bone. Yes, it is. It's who I've always been. Neil brought his disfigured face to my ear and eerily whispered, I was stalking you on the mountain that day. No, I'd gasped. Yes, Neil confirmed. I wanted to eat you so badly. I needed to eat you. Then, I took pity on you and decided to keep you around. My little pet. Hot tears stung my eyes. I needed to get out of there. Neil then licked my ear before biting down hard on it with his fangs. In a panicked daze, I shoulder-checked him and got to my feet as fast as I could. What was left of my ear burned like hell. I coupled my hand over the bleeding appendage and made a dash for the backyard. Neil chased after me, my blood and flesh dripping down his chin. I stumbled out of the back door, past the flower petals and candles. As Neil followed, he didn't even seem to notice my romantic display. Why would he? He was too busy trying to eat me. In my hurry, I slipped on a stray rose petal. I crashed to the ground, dislocating my shoulder, flipping on my back to get a visual on Neil. I found he was carefully stalking up to me, reveling in the hunt, about to go in for the kill. At my wit's end, I looked around for something, anything, to use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a candle. Something in my gut told me to go for it. I grabbed the hot glass and held it out in front of me. Stay back. In response, Neil backed away, almost cowering. Stay the fuck back, I yelled again, louder this time, throwing the candle at him. He yelped and dodged. The unfamiliar expression of fear filled Neil's face, when only a moment ago he seemed invincible. Then I realized, loud noise and the flames spooked him. God damn, how could I have been so stupid? Neon, a mix of adrenaline, fear, and anger, allowed me to pick myself up off the ground. I looked around the back patio. An idea formed in my head as I saw all the candles I'd laid out. I grabbed 2 candles, then ran to the heart made of white roses. I tipped the candle's flames toward the flammable petals that composed the heart. In an instant, it was a burning blaze. Neil backed down as he stared at the flames. He roared threateningly as he continued to move away, giving me enough distance to flee. But as soon as it started, the fire stopped, the intense heat of the flames melting the flowers in mere seconds. My great distraction fizzled out into nothing but a thick, white smoke. With the perceived threat gone, Neil regained his courage. He lunged. I barely managed to hold my hands up defensively. Down, Neon, down, a deep male voice shouted suddenly. Neil's body ragdolled and he fell on the patio in front of me. He'd gone from 100 to 0 in an instant. Somehow, he'd passed out. There was a strange older man standing outside the back door. His white hair was long and wispy, with a beard to match. He wore cargo shorts and a grey hoodie. He looked menacing and welcoming at the same time, giving off this immense aura. I stared at him in fear and confusion. Relax, my child, the man started, taking a step closer to me. I'm here to help. Nien, was I could muster, looking at Neil's limp body. Yes, that's correct. He spoke. I remembered hearing or reading about a deity when I learned about the Neon's existence. This deity was the one who taught the townsfolk how to scare away the creature when it came down the mountain to feed every year. That's why Chinese New Year is filled with red, fireworks, masks, and everything that scared the giant creature away. Could this be him? As if he read my mind, the man spoke. Yes, I gaped in awe. First I was about to propose to the Neon, and then I was in the presence of an actual god. You see, long ago, after I helped those townspeople, the Neon came to me. He was miserable, alone and starving up on that mountaintop. He begged me to make him human so he wouldn't be alone. the deity explained. I granted his wishes, on the condition that he gave up eating meat forever. If he faltered and gave in to his primal desires, he'd instantly transform back into his original form, banned from seeing the humans ever again. My broken form stood there shocked at what I was hearing. Well, I best be off then. I'll be taking the Neon with me. It's my fault.
I stuttered out.
Stopping the god from his departure. It was an accident. I switched our meals. The deity looked at Neil, then back to me. Is that so? Yes. Don't punish him. Please. It wasn't his fault. He attacked and tried to kill you, yet you still defend him, he noted. Why? Because I love him, I answered truthfully. The godly man took a second to mull everything over. Very well then. I'll give him another chance. But he's going back to China, and you will never be able to see him again. Do you understand? The events of the last 15 minutes flashed in my head. Neil's bitter words echoed against my skull. Don't have to tell me twice. The god snapped his fingers. Neil returned to his human state and began to stir. I'll give you 2 minutes to say your goodbyes. I nodded my head firmly and prepared myself. I hadn't planned for the night to end like this. For us to end like this. Oh my God, Neil muttered as he got up and looked at me and the mess surrounding us. Mikkel. I chuckled ruefully, grabbing the ring box out of my pocket with my good arm, chucking it at Neil. The lid popped open, revealing the diamond ring inside. What a night. I'm so sorry, was all he could say as he stared at the gorgeous ring I'd picked out for him. He looked behind him and found the deity watching us. Neil turned back to me. All those things, horrible, terrible things, I said. I don't know what to say. What can I do to make it up to you? You can't, I answered, my lips trembling. I can't. We're over. Michelle, I need you to know, I really do love you. I always have and I always will. You have to know that before you go. A tear slipped down my cheek. Goodbye, Neil. He bowed his head down in acceptance. See you Monday. It's time to go, the deity said. Neil and him then disappeared in a flash. The only thing left behind was my empty ring box. I moved out of Colorado shortly after, quit my job, sold the cabin, and swore off dating for a while. After taking some time to heal and process, I got another, better, marketing job after I moved across the country to Orlando, Florida. I needed to get far away from the Rockies. I'm in a great spot, really. Smack dab in the middle of the city, right by Disney. Every night I'm comforted by the fireworks show they have every night. I can't sleep without those thundering loud booms now. So yeah, that's why I don't trust vegans. There's always going to be that possibility that one day they'll transform into a mythological creature and try to eat me. It's crazy what some people will put up with for a little bit of money. Desperate times, I suppose. Well, I am one of those desperate people. Desperation to get my daughter a life-saving medical treatment is what drove me to where I am now. That same desperation has led to daily fear of what might happen next to Danny and I, now that it's over. I had no choice. I needed money right away. I couldn't qualify for a loan, and the damn insurance company said the treatment was not authorized under our policy. My work was barely paying over minimum wage, and I still needed almost $5,000. The only way this would work is if I got another job working graveyard somewhere else, at least until I could save enough to get her the treatment. Danny was all I had left. I already lost her mother a year ago in that car crash. I couldn't lose her too. I looked high and low. I combed the classifieds and drove around desperately searching for a job that could pay what I needed and have an available night shift as well. The prospect seemed hopeless, but I had to find something soon. The town we lived in was small, and the prospect seemed bleak. That was when, in a streak of what felt like luck at the time, I inquired about a job at a small grocery store about a mile away from where we live. It was called She's Nighttime Convenience and Grocery. It was an odd little store that was closed during the day and seemed to open at around 8 p.m. and close sometime before morning. The weird hours seemed off, and I didn't know who would want to shop at a store that was only open in the middle of the night when there were 24-hour chains elsewhere. Though it did not really matter. It was a store. I needed a job, and the unique hours in this case would work for the schedule I needed. I decided to try and apply for a job there. I was on my way home after finishing a shift at my day job. My friend Kathy was nice enough to watch Danny while I was working, and had even agreed to do so if I found a graveyard shift somewhere else as well, at least for a month or two if needed. Since I had seen the odd shop and saw the hours, I decided to inquire about a job at the lonesome and odd little store that seemed to only be open at night. I was reluctant at first, since I thought they might have some illicit reasons to only be open at such hours. Despite my misgivings, I realized it was the best hope I had of getting a job with my minimal skill set, and that was a guaranteed graveyard shift. I got out of my car and walked up to the entrance. The place was pretty run down, but seemed to still have signage up and around the front. There were sale signs and clearance items advertised, and the somewhat normal facade of a grocery store made me relax and continue with my intended course. I noticed up close there was a mark under the first part of the store name. It looked like Japanese kanji or something, see? I stepped inside, and it seemed deceptively large compared to how small it looked on the outside. There were aisles of various groceries and other household supplies, and even some clothes racks. I had no idea how it was this large an operation. Most of the shoppers seemed fairly normal at first, though there were some people who you could tell preferred to do their shopping at night. I tried not to stare as I received a rather murderous-looking glare from one such individual who I must have let my eyes linger on too long. The staff also looked about the same as any other store's staff would look, fairly diverse and no one with an overly cheery or overly sullen mood about them. I did notice there was not a lot of talking near the checkouts. Moving on, I looked near the front, intent on finding a manager's office to inquire at. I felt hopeful when I saw a sign that I thought read, "Help Wanted." I felt a bit confused and less optimistic when I read the full content of the rather strange sign stating, "Help Wanted, but not always needed." I was not sure how to take that, so I decided to look for someone to ask. As I approached the back office and went to knock on the door, I was interrupted by a large man with a blue store apron and a name badge indicating he was Store Manager Benny. The large man welcomed me with a pleasant, though slightly forced, "Hello, can I help you find something today?" I was distracted by the almost pained expression on his face, like his smile would eventually shatter the muscles in his face if he kept it on for a moment longer. Brushing past the distraction, I remembered why I was there. Yes, I was actually looking to apply for a job here. I stated my earnest intent while gesturing to the help sign near the door. Benny stopped smiling and looked at the sign, and then looked as if he was about to say something when he held up a finger and pulled out a radio from his pocket. "Molly, what is the bagger situation today? How are we holding up staff-wise?" There was no immediate response. He smiled again in that disturbing way while he drummed his fingers along his tie as he awaited a response. His face wrinkled and then he stated, "I am sorry, I think we might be full at the moment, but thanks for your interest." He was about to usher me away when his radio barked to life and I heard a static-laden voice on the line. I couldn't hear everything, but it sounded strange, and I thought I heard something like, "Rob, caught, problem, and bagger got bagged." I didn't know what to make of the weird bits I heard, but before I could think twice about it, I heard Benny mumble, "All right, but next time answer faster. It could have been a code black, and if you mess around with those customers, it is your ass next." I was still standing there in awkward silence when he wheeled around and his frustrated veneer vanished, and he was back to the awful fake smile as he loudly proclaimed, "Congratulations. There is an opening available now. Let's get you set up. Can you start tonight?" "Right now, as in tonight?" I asked, thoroughly surprised they would want me to start immediately and without any application or vetting process to speak of. "Yes, right now. Don't worry, we can sort out all the legal stuff later, but for tonight we are actually a bit busier than normal and we could use the help. First though, let's talk terms and some mandatory paperwork." I was not sure what he meant, but I figured it might mean a salary negotiation. "Sure. What is the pay and benefits?" I knew it was a little tacky to ask up front. But I needed that money badly, and Danny couldn't afford for me to get taken for a ride by someone lowballing my wages. $45 an hour is the pay for baggers, which is what we normally start people as. I almost gasped aloud. That was crazy for a grocery store bag boy. My surprise was apparent, and Benny held up a hand and cut off my next question, stating, "We value hard work and integrity here and just a wee bit of discretion." He laughed aloud and slapped his knee. "But in all seriousness, there is a non-disclosure agreement we do need you to sign with the paperwork." He grinned again, and I thought the discretion bit, an NDA, was weird. But that was double what I was making at my day job, so I was overjoyed at the prospect. He continued, "Health coverage and dental are fully covered, but no life insurance. Those policies always have some trouble for some reason." His grin widened as he said the last part, and it looked even more fake than before. Despite some disturbing implications, I could scarcely hear the alarm bells in my head over my future payday. I had found a miracle. I would be able to get enough money in about a month working here and my day job. I would be able to get Danny that treatment. I didn't need to be asked twice. I readily agreed to the offer. "Very good decision. Welcome to the Sher family. Ed, get out here and get our new hire an apron and a tag, and start with the simple version of the bagger training." An unpleasant-looking older man emerged from the back room and was holding an apron, and moving with an odd gait that might have indicated some previous injury or the like. I forced a smile and introduced myself, but the man, Ed as I heard his name, did not reciprocate. He looked me up and down and snorted derisively in a way that was hard not to take offense to. I let it go and waited for him to say something, just before opening my mouth to ask when the training started. He cut me off and humorlessly asked, "You know baggin', fella?" "Baggin'? Like bagging groceries?" I tried to clarify. He glared at me and just nodded his head. "Well, yeah. I mean, I have a general idea. I never worked at a grocery store before, but I think I know how things should be bagged, generally speaking." He paused an uncomfortably long time, and I was about to try and speak again when he snorted and gave a rather unpleasant throaty laugh that ended in a dry coughing fit. After he finished, he said, "Not like this, I'm guessing you don't. All right then, come on. I will show you how we do the baggin' and also the other rules. Reckon you better listen close. I ain't for repeating myself." I nodded my head, and we started towards the back room when I heard the radio on, his belt come to life, and a very nervous-sounding voice on the other line say, "Code black. Repeat code black." Ed's face wrinkled in a way that somehow made him look even more annoyed than usual. God damn it all. More of them fellas already. He turned and left, angrily shouting some imperceptible grunts and complaints into the walkie, and left me near the back room dumbstruck and not sure of what to do next. What was a code black? Why was everyone afraid of them? I was about to go look for someone when I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I wheeled around to see a woman. The tag on her shirt read, "Assistant Manager, Molly." She smiled at me, and it did seem more genuine than some of the others here. "I'm sorry we have not met. You must be the new hire. I'm Molly, the AM here. I can help you with training and orientation. You can be a great asset here at Shiz." She held a hand toward the backroom doors and ushered me toward them. We moved into the backroom halls, and as I looked around, I saw several doors that looked like ice boxes. I figured they must store a lot of products to need that many freezers scattered about. Visible near the freezers' doors were shelves of other inventory. There were rows of boxes and pallets of strange things like chemicals, metalworking gear, various pieces of hardware, and crates that had gun manufacturers' names on them. I was wondering again just what kind of store this really was. Besides the odd inventory, it was also kind of a mess, and I was glad I wouldn't be the one having to sort all of it. We made our way to an office room with oppressively bright blue painted walls, like a kindergarten classroom. The sight reminded me of when Danny was in kindergarten, and I steeled my resolve against any difficulty this job might have. I needed to do this for her. The office was sparse. There was only a desk, some chairs, and a file cabinet. I did notice on the walls, painted on the bright blue, were some black characters that almost looked like calligraphy. More of those kanji were on the wall, and again I wondered what they meant.
Before I
She gestured for me to sit down at one of the only two chairs, in this case the one facing the desk. I sat down and she sat opposite me. She looked over a few pieces of paper she had on a clipboard, and then smiled, turned around and started rummaging through a file cabinet. As I was waiting, a sudden shriek was heard outside, and I looked to the door and suppressed a gasp. Molly didn't react and kept looking for something. I thought maybe she hadn't heard it, and I was about to say something when she wheeled around with a large binder in hand and dropped it onto the desk with a loud crash. "Before training starts, please fill out this form for your safety and ours." She handed me a piece of paper that, when reading the details, seemed to be the non-disclosure agreement Benny had mentioned. I thought it was odd I had to sign this, but other hiring documents like tax, payroll and healthcare paperwork were not required before starting. I considered they might be paying people under the table, which I hated to admit I might prefer, since no tax deduction meant I could save money faster. I signed all too quickly without realizing what I was agreeing to keep quiet and what the consequences imposed were if I didn't. Molly took the paper, looked it over and said, "Good, that is settled. Well, let's get started. This is the employee handbook. We only have one, so you are going to be doing some light reading for a bit, because we need the manpower now, though. I will go through it with you quickly." Since Ed was indisposed, she grimaced when she said the last word and looked at her watch, and then adjusted a dial on her walkie-talkie. She looked back at me and resumed, "As a bagger, you are vital in ensuring customers leave satisfied with their product, and you are one of the last people they will see on the way out, except in certain circumstances." She cleared her throat loudly in time to some muffled noise I thought I heard somewhere else in the back room. Basic rules and code of conduct are as follows. You are to bag products to the customer's satisfaction. The first thing you are to ask customers is what type of bags they want. Whatever they say goes as far as how to bag things and with what bags. You are not to ask about or discuss the purchases of the customers, no matter how curious you are or how talkative they might be. No questions. Period. Understood. She slammed her fist on the binder, and I jumped back, startled, as she looked at me. I stammered out a quick acknowledgement. Yes, understood." "Good," she said, and continued with the list. No assistance may be provided to customers for loading or unloading things from their vehicles. If a customer requests help to their vehicle, do not under any circumstances assist or leave the building with them or any customer at any time, regardless of the story they give you as to why they need help. It is our policy and they know this. If requests persist or you are feeling intimidated or threatened, you are to press the yellow button at the end of each checkout by the bagging station. A security personnel will escort the offending customer to aisle 4 for processing and detainment. Wait, detainment? They don't just kick them out. I thought that was weird. She continued with the next rule before I could ask about it. The most important rule: occasionally there will be a special bag request. You will know it when you hear it. If ordered, press the black button by the end of the checkout and proceed with code black protocol. These guests are normally our highest paying customers and often are here at the pleasure of Mr. Shah himself. They must be attended as quickly as possible. There it was. Code black again. What special bag was she talking about? Ignoring the look of concern spreading over my face, she continued. Cell phones, smart watches, or quite literally anything that could be used as a recording device are strictly prohibited while on duty, both for our customers' sake and for our own. Store closes at 4 a.m. exactly. Any customers who remain will be escorted out. Only exception being any customers who are involved in a code black. No access is allowed to the basement and inventory back rooms. Only managers and stock employees allowed. Simple, right? Any questions? She asked, while flashing another smile. Well, I did have a few questions about the... She cut me off mid-sentence, talking over me and saying, "Good. I knew you looked like a fast learner. Come on, let's get you out to the check stands and bagging." She grabbed my shoulder surprisingly hard and pulled me out of the office and back into the store proper. I saw a few customers look at me getting pulled along, and I saw some snickers, and I felt a bit embarrassed. I was led to a checkout with a flickering 3 next to it. The other two were busy with customers waiting in line to be helped by a cashier and bagger a few feet away from where I would be standing. We stopped, and Molly cleared her throat loudly to get the attention of a young man with dirty blonde hair and a rather unimpressed expression on his face. "Hello, Lee. This is our new bagger. Show him the ropes and try to be easy on him. It's his first day. I know it's busy, but we don't need another Rob situation so soon. Have fun, you two." She walked away without another word to the back room, and I was left there with Lee, as I heard his name was staring at me. I tried to break the ice. "Hi, my name is..." "Save it," he responded abruptly. "I don't want to get attached, just in case. I liked Rob, he was my friend, and now it's best not to talk about what happened to him. Just do your job and follow the rules and you should be fine." I didn't know how to respond to the blunt introduction, but I figured he seemed nicer than that Ed guy, so I just walked up to the bagging station and gave him a mock salute and tried to put a smile on my face. It was going to be a long night. The first customer came through, and Lee wordlessly scanned their items. I proceeded to grab a few nearby bags when I felt a sharp kick in my leg. Lee was glaring at me like I had just slapped his mother. "What?" I thought I was supposed to. Then I looked at the customer who was frowning at me, and I remembered. "Hello, what type of bag would you like?" The customer, an older woman, sneered at me and finally accepted the question and said flatly, "Paper, please," and did her best to pretend I didn't exist while I was bagging her items, mostly groceries, produce, meat and dairy. There were a few odd pieces, like a set of kitchen knives and what looked like boxes of some sort of firearm ammunition. I was about to ask about them when I remembered the rules. I tried to ignore it and just carry on. She left wordlessly and more customers piled into our line. As the night went on, I started to see less normal items and more disturbing things. One customer had bought zip ties, large volumes of what looked like medical-grade sedatives, and several bags of candy. Another bought an ungodly amount of various weapons ammunition and several large fruits like watermelon and honeydew. I thought he might be just shooting some fruit for target practice until I saw what appeared to be a Kevlar vest and an uncomfortable amount of alcohol. After a douse in very disturbing customers came through, I finally found someone who seemed a bit friendly. She was a kindly old woman who seemed to enjoy speaking to me, and by all accounts was very nice. It was a much-needed reprieve, and I actually enjoyed talking with her. Her name was Marge, and she was just buying some baking supplies. Eggs, butter, flour, spices, all pretty normal things. "You simply must try my raspberry tart, it is divine. I will bring some by next time. Or better yet, I think I still have some in my car. Won't you be a doll and help an old woman with her groceries?" I was about to accept when I saw Lee's face go blank, and he just shook his head. I looked back at Marge, and she had a wide grin on her face, and I looked down at the second half of her groceries yet to be bagged. There were containers of various chemicals, including rat poison, bleach, and ammonia. I tried to speak, but I frowncy, and she asked again. "Come on, dearie. My hip is in bad shape after my fall. It will only be a moment, and you can have a treat and a nice tip as well." Her grin shifted in a way that made me very uncomfortable, and I struggled to speak, but finally blurted out, "No thank you, ma'am. Store policy. We are not to escort customers out of the store under any conditions." The knocking started about a week ago. I had fallen asleep on the couch again, and it was so loud that I yelped as I jolted awake. I was disoriented, of course, caught off guard by both the rude awakening and the awkward position in which I had passed out. I started to stumble to the front door, both eyes still half closed, when the unusual hour registered to me. Who the hell would be at my door at this hour? I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and made my way to the vestibule. The small panes of frosted glass framing the front door usually let me know what to expect in terms of visitors, but I couldn't make anything out through the darkness. Whoever was there hadn't set off the motion sensor light, nor had they knocked again. I was only a moment away from dismissing it as a fabrication of my dreaming mind when the knocking came again. It was loud and insistent, but it wasn't coming from the front door. The sound echoed through the house from the rear, the back door. That was even weirder. I couldn't tell if they'd started at the front and moved around the house, or if I'd been too surprised to note the direction of the sound when I awoke. Either way, it had definitely freaked me out. I was glad I had had the foresight to draw the sitting room's blinds before I fell asleep. I didn't like the idea that whoever was knocking might have been able to spy me sleeping through the window. I made my way as silently as I could down the hall and into the kitchen, where I paused for a moment. The back door, which opened into my small backyard, was in the adjacent laundry room. My heart raced slightly, and my breaths were just a touch quicker than was comfortable. I couldn't deny that I was spooked. I tried to rationalize why someone might be knocking at my back door so late at night. I lived alone and didn't have family in town. None of my friends tended toward mischievousness, or I might have suspected a prank. I didn't know my neighbors. In my wildest anxieties, I could picture the cops showing up at my door to arrest me for some infraction I hadn't realized I'd committed. But surely they would come to the front door like any other polite visitor. All I could think was that it was some trick, a scam, a way to get me to open the door so I could be held at knife point and robbed. I crept towards the back door, trying to get as good a view as possible without exposing myself to the large window that made up most of the door's upper third. It was no use. Whoever was there, I couldn't see them. Just like in the front, the motion sensor lights hadn't activated. I took another heartbeat or two to muster my courage and then stepped right up to back door. I could see, my eyes having adjusted by now to the darkness, that no one was there. The window revealed only the small, disheveled yard. Though it was in need of some minor groundskeeping, it harbored no uninvited guests. The knocks that came then made me jump nearly out of my skin. I barely avoided pissing myself. They hadn't come from the back door or the front. I could tell now, from where I was standing, that they came from the basement door. It was set into the wall on the far side of the kitchen, just a short distance away from where I stood. Someone was in my basement, knocking on the door. That door doesn't lock, and there was no other way into the basement. Whoever was down there was already in my house. They must have broken in earlier and then waited. It felt like some kind of sick game. My blood froze. All I could hear was the echo of the knocks, reverberating through my skull. I silently thanked God that I had fallen asleep on the couch, still fully clothed. With my phone in my pocket, I wasted no time calling the police. The dispatcher had me make my way back to the front and outside, so I could meet the police as they arrived. The entire time I was on the line, only a handful of minutes, I was terrified that some axe-wielding maniac was going to come bursting through the door and disembowel me. What actually happened was almost worse. The cops found nothing, no signs of forced entry, nobody in the basement, no indication that what I had experienced had happened at all, other than my obvious cowering. The cops were sympathetic, if a little frustrated. They suggested that I had had a bad dream. If it happened again, they said, more condescendingly than I appreciated, I was welcome to call again. It did happen again, the following night. It had been a long day at work and I was tired. My boss had been sympathetic, at least, but it was obvious I was preoccupied and unfocused. She sent me home early that day. I crawled into bed only after I'd checked all the locks, all the possible points of egress into my home, and then checked again to make sure they were secure. I even forced myself to head down into the basement, just to prove to myself that no one was hiding down there. The basement is small, one room, and mostly a featureless one at that. No windows, just a couple of shelves and the half a dozen or so boxes that I still hadn't gotten around to unpacking. I even opened up the boxes, just to make sure the only things inside them were knickknacks and assorted junk. When I was satisfied with my search, I breathed a small sigh of relief. Not a psycho killer to be found. Despite that, I was uneasy still. There wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a sense that I wasn't welcome. I suppose it's not uncommon to be afraid of basements, but I hadn't ever felt like this before. I used to think it was juvenile. As I said, the knocking returned that night. I woke up much more composed than I had the night before. My phone and a mid-sized knife I had brought up from the kitchen lay in easy reach. Again, I called the police, and again they found nothing. I was left with the distinct impression that they would not welcome a third call. The knocking returned the following night, and the night after. I didn't call the police, and I didn't get out of bed. I just laid there and listened to it. Timed the knocks. The earliest it started was 1:23 a.m., and the latest it ended was 4:11 a.m. Each set of knocks came sporadically, sometimes only 2 minutes between knocks, and sometimes as long as half an hour. If there was any kind of pattern to it, it eluded me. I changed tactics the following night. I needed to know that I wasn't imaging things. I asked a drinking buddy of mine, Connor, if he wouldn't mind staying over at my place just for the one night. I told him what had been happening. I think he thought I was being silly, but he agreed. I had tried to communicate its importance without sounding desperate, or like I was losing my mind, but I doubt I succeeded. He showed up at my place just after sundown. I supplied pizza and beer, my part of the deal in disrupting his schedule. So, what exactly am I here for? Man, he asked as we ate, you think there's someone hiding in your basement? I let out a heavy sigh. I don't know. I keep hearing someone knock and it's freaking me out. Honestly, I just hope it happens again while you're here, so I can prove to myself that I'm not completely insane. He laughed at that. I think you're past the point of insanity. Bud. I smiled, but I was nervous that nothing would happen, that him being there would prove nothing. He slept on the couch that night, at my request. It was closer to the basement door, and I wanted to make sure he could hear the knocks. When they resounded through my home that night, as aggressive and insistent as ever, I leapt from my bed and rushed downstairs, nearly tripping over myself in the process. I was stunned to find Connor sleeping peacefully on couch, blissfully unaware. Wake up, I was nearly shouting as I shook his shoulders. His eyes snapped open and his face twisted with shock. What? Jesus Christ. Man, you scared me. He Saturday up and shook his head a little, evidently trying to recover from the heart attack I'd almost given him. Did you hear it? I could tell from the look on his face that he hadn't. I felt wild, coursing with adrenaline. It's fine. It always happens more than once. Connor was not happy about it, but we sat there on the couch, in near total silence, for 1 hour, and then another. His patience dwindled. Listen, he said, you know I work at 8 a.m. I can't stay up all night. I'm sorry, but I didn't hear anything. His voice was calm, but the effort involved in maintaining it that way was palpable. I left him, both of us frustrated, and returned to my bed. The knocks continued a short time later. He didn't mention them before he left in the morning. I was desperate. I felt hounded in my own home, like a rabbit cowering in its burrow as a wolf stalks outside. Except my wolf was inside my burrow. I could sense its presence in the air, dripping eager saliva, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I had to face it, to put a stop to it. I didn't know what else to do. The knocking and the attendant anxiety kept me up at night and ruined my days. I felt like a crazy person, fraught and irrational. I could stay in a hotel for a few nights or maybe couch surf for a while, but my savings would only last so long, and both of those solutions could only ever be temporary. I could move, sell my house and go elsewhere, but what if the knocking followed me? I didn't think I could take that. The next night, I camped outside the basement door, clutching the kitchen knife, waiting for the knocking to start. I didn't have to wait long. The second that first knock shook the door, I lunged for the knob and wrenched it open. The solitary knock echoed in my mind, but behind the door was only silence and darkness. I gazed down the basement stairs. I knew I would have to descend. I moved gingerly, knife and phone light held out in front of me, down the steps and into the small cement room. "Who are you?" I yelled, swinging the knife and the light around wildly, desperately trying to pin down my harasser. "Leave me alone!" The basement's grey walls seemed to drink in the sound of my shouting and gave nothing return. I stayed down there for what must have been an hour, heart pounding and blood rushing, slashing at shadows. Eventually, exhausted and as terrified as ever, I had to admit that there was nothing here. I'm losing my goddamn mind. I had taken one step up the stairs when my blood turned to ice. The basement door was closed. I was sure I had left it open when I came down. To mitigate the sense of claustrophobia, I ascended on tiptoe, forcing myself to take steady breaths. The knob didn't budge. The door wouldn't open. I couldn't understand why. There was no lock on this door, no latch, no other means of barring it shut. I hoped even, for a moment, that perhaps something heavy had been placed in front of it, but I could see well enough through the door's undercut into the kitchen. I've tried to shoulder the door down. I've stabbed at it with the knife, tried to bash off the knob. Nothing has worked, not even a scratch on the white wood. I've tried the police again. My call wouldn't go through. I've tried texting Connor, my boss, anyone who might be able to help me, but they've all gone undelivered. It's been hours. All I can do now is pound on the basement door, scream for help, and hope somebody comes to let me out. I've written this as a last-ditch effort. I'm going to try and post it anywhere I can. My internet is barely functioning, not well enough for the messaging apps. My phone is at 6%. I don't have any food or water. If you can read this, please, let me out. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.